In Daniel 4, we have the confession of the king of Babylon about the rulership of the God Most High. We have a similar confession, but in an odd place in Daniel 5. Daniel 4 was a chiasm. Guess what? So is Daniel 5. But the differences go very deep from there on. We'll see that as we study this message. Last week's lesson was from pride to humility. This week's is from arrogance to destruction, which is part of the contrast between the two lessons. They are quite stark. And we want to start with our memory jam, as we try to do on a regular basis here. Daniel 2:21. We're in Daniel 5 for a lesson, but Daniel 2:21 is going to be our memory verse. And he changes the times and seasons. He removes kings, and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Daniel 2:21. We have talked repeatedly in these lessons. I've talked repeatedly about the three great themes of Daniel: the God who rules, the God who gives wisdom, and the God who delivers. And we will see those three in action tonight as well, not surprisingly. I apologize. This one is also pre-recorded because, Lord willing, I'm on the road tonight on my way back, but will not make it back in time to do the lesson live. Nevertheless, I think we have something that's going to be interesting here as we study from arrogance to destruction. Time has passed. We have heard the last from Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, and it was a great testimony to the God of heaven. And tonight we're going to go with Daniel 5. And guess what? Daniel 5 is, yes, a chiasm. Again, Daniel went to such trouble. The author of Daniel went to such trouble because he wants us to understand who God is and what God is doing. And so we have this guy, so he's gone to this trouble to construct everything so that we will get the most important message. Out of the last one, we got the message, the center of the chiasm was the relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, and that Daniel was saddened by the message about Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar had affection. We saw this because it develops into the fact that God actually delivers Nebuchadnezzar from his pride, and God loves Nebuchadnezzar. God loves Belshazzar too, but not everyone can be reached. Jesus had 12 disciples, and one of them betrayed him. We just have to understand these simple truths. And we have a chiasm here. This all is based on the work of Dr. William Shea, an outstanding scholar, one of my teachers at the seminary. And his work on Daniel is really outstanding. And we have here the very first part of the chiasm is the banquet. And there are three sections. There is the banquet itself, the handwriting on the wall, and the offer of honors for interpretation. We jump into the action, as it were, of this lesson very, very rapidly. It's their banquet. And I talked about in the very first week that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem, and he'd taken the vessels of gold and silver. Well, gold and silver will play a big role, and those vessels will play a big role in what's happening tonight. And as I said, they also set the tone in Daniel 1 that the sanctuary, God's sanctuary, is going to play an important part in the book of Daniel. And in fact, the great time prophecies will deal with God's sanctuary. And so this is something that we find, this recurring theme of these gold and silver vessels. But tonight, as we begin, it's not in the most positive light. The banquet. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. This is a way of showing superiority. We are superior to the God of the Israelites. We can drink our wine out of his things that were designed for him. And especially since it was often thought that humans fed the gods. This would be very common when you made a sacrifice or a wine offering to a god, that you were feeding that god. And so here they're taking, and not that God thought that, but they thought that. And here they're taking vessels which were designed in their minds to feed the God of Israel, and they're drinking from them. They're taking from those. So this is a very sacrilegious, a very blasphemous, a very direct act of defiance of the God. And remember those three great themes: the God who rules, the God who gives wisdom, and the God who delivers. Well, when you put your thumb in the eye of the God who rules, you might be surprised if you lose rulership. But that's what they're trying to, that's what's going on here. That's the subtext, is that we're so superior we can do this. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. Now, they drank wine in these vessels of gold and silver, but they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron and wood and stone. Notice here, gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. We talk about this in the Psalms and other places, that these gods cannot hear. They have eyes, they can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear, and so forth. And here they're taking the vessels from the God who can hear, the God who gives wisdom, and they are praising the gods who can't hear, can't move, can't do anything. And they are of, at best, equal gold and silver. At worst, they are far inferior: bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And so this is all here. But notice the order: gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, here's part two, the fingers of the man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Well, there's just a dramatic picture of this. You can imagine this disembodied hand, and it starts writing on the wall. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. This man is barely able to stand up. He is terrified. He went from being the king of everything, arrogant, I can drink out of the vessels of the God of the Israelites because I'm better than him, to this rather pathetic figure. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom." Now, we mentioned this earlier, that for many years that Belshazzar was unknown in any other sources. He now is known, and we now know that his father, who was Nebuchadnezzar's son, was out in the desert collecting gods. He was kind of a recluse. And so technically Belshazzar was the second ruler in the land, and the third was the best he could offer. That's why he says the third ruler in the land. There's not somebody between him and this person, but rather there's someone above Belshazzar, even in Babylon, not counting the God of heaven, who's already made his power and presence known. He's the God who actually rules. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. We have here, again, as we had in chapter 4, a parallel to chapter 2. This time it isn't a dream, it's this vision, which apparently others saw as well. But he brings in the usual suspects, so to speak, and none of them can help him. None of them can help him. And it's reminded of this is the young ruler in many ways who just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. He has no experience, but he thinks he's king of the world. As someone once said, he was born on third base and thought he'd hit a triple. Well, that seems to be this guy's problem. He's born on third base. He's born already one of the elite, and he thinks that that he has something to do with it. All right. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed because his wise man can't tell him. He's brought in these people and they can't do their job. And his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever." Now, this is the common greeting to the king in ancient Oriental societies. King, live forever. In fact, we have the same thing in England. Long live the queen. That's the same kind of thing. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. So this is his grandmother, perhaps his great-grandmother. And when it says the days of your father, it doesn't mean necessarily that Nebuchadnezzar was literally his father, but that he was the head of the line. This terminology is used often in the Bible, that Abraham is our father, the Pharisees said. Just indicates lineal descent. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This is because an extraordinary spirit, a knowledge, insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. So that's the queen's speech. As you'll notice that you can see it down below. This is mirroring the Daniel make a speech. The centerpiece of this chapter, surprising to me, at least, is that Belshazzar's speech is the centerpiece, because Belshazzar is such a pathetic creature. And then he calls this a literary joint. William Shea calls this a literary joint because it's necessary to get from one place to the other. Daniel is called and Daniel comes, and it is, but it's just basically a transition. It doesn't. There's no content in that way, and the same thing happens in the mirroring literary joint too, where the king requests and Daniel replies. The first one, Daniel's requested to come and he shows up. Second one, the king requests him to do something and Daniel replies. So they match each other. And that brings us to the center point of Daniel 5. The center point, the main point of this chiasm. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you the Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." We don't like repetition in our culture, but in the biblical culture of the time, this is emphasis. The fact that it's repeated verbatim tells you that this is important. Just now, the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of this message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. The three great themes: remember the God who rules, the God who gives wisdom, and the God who delivers. And here we have one of those fascinating things where the testimony to God giving Daniel wisdom is made by the person who will benefit the least in this case, by the the opposite of Nebuchadnezzar, who is humbled and who comes to God. Belshazzar is proud, and he is petty, and he is arrogant, and he is a trivial character except for his station. And yet he also testifies that it is God who gives wisdom. This is going to become more and more important when we get to the prophetic chapters, that Daniel is being given the keys to prophecy, the keys to history, to understanding the great events of Earth's history. And this is being reinforced again and again in these earlier chapters, historical chapters. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So this is the literary join. Then Daniel answered and said before him, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make known to him. It's interesting because, of course, Daniel is the one who understands that these rewards will be worth very little. In fact, essentially nothing before the night is done. He understands what the prophecy is, and he's going to tell him that. And because he understands that, the rewards are inconsequential, really, as far as he's concerned. They just don't matter. They aren't that big a deal. Daniel's speech. This mirrors the queen's speech. Remember, the queen's speech was how there was this one in his father's day who had wisdom. So Daniel's speech is mirroring hers. O King, the Most High God, granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. Daniel is pressing home the message. Even the great Nebuchadnezzar was humbled when he was arrogant. It falls on deaf ears. The arrogant almost never recognize their own arrogance. They're so certain they're right, it never occurs to them they might be mistaken. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of the beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. He's trying to drive home. It's the last chance, literally, the last possibility, if there is one, for Belshazzar to humble himself. Because the enemy is literally at the gates. He doesn't know it. Now it's interesting. We have the banquet. Now we have the interpretation of the banquet. Because you see, the action is important. The banquet itself is an event here that needs interpretation, that needs to be understood in its significance. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and of gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or understand, but the God in whose hand you are life breath in all your ways you have not glorified. In other words, he's saying, you knew all this already. I'm not telling you anything new. He knew about his grandfather, his father's madness about his 7 years in the wilderness, his 7 years of unreason. And yet you brought the vessels and you drank from them. This act of blasphemy is over the line. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Yeah, the Upharsin of the Peres, either one says Persians and one says Farsi, which is the language of the Persians. To this day, it was Farsi. So it's interesting. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Mene, mene, numbered, weighed and wanting. That's what this is. Numbered, weighed and wanting. You don't add up. You don't make the cut. Your arrogance has disqualified you. You've done nothing to add to this kingdom, and yet you celebrate your rulership as though you had done something. You haven't even learned from the lessons of your forebears. You haven't understood the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, that there's only one God, the God of heaven. Instead of recognizing that, you have profaned the vessels from his temple. They were entrusted to Nebuchadnezzar, not to you. And because you have done this, it's over. And notice that first we had, in the first part, we had gold and silver, the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Here we have the gods of silver and gold. Why the inversion? Why is gold and silver in the first one and silver and gold in the second one? And some have seen that I've covered this in another video. The answer actually goes back to Daniel 2 and the vision of the great statue. Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, and that followed by silver, the silver empire. Well, as they speak, as Daniel speaks to Belshazzar, the silver kingdom of Persia is entering the city of Babylon and will conquer it. So silver is now, if you will, preeminent. Silver will rule gold. And that's why they go from the gods of gold and silver to the gods of silver and gold, because you think the conquering powers God is ruling. Well, so do the Persians. And now they are conquering the golden empire. Belshazzar gave orders. They clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he had now had authority as third ruler of the kingdom. Now here comes the epilogue. It's not part of the chiasm. It is the verdict, the result of all this. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So here comes Darius, the king of silver, kills and conquers the king of gold. That's why the inversion here. And why is the focus in the chiasm on the center, on Belshazzar? Why is that there? Because, as we mentioned, even this pathetic arrogant, foolish man testifies. And in fact, he testifies, if you will, to his own destruction, to his own inadequacies, to his own, we don't say conversion, but his own, the condemnation. He's heard it, but he has not taken it to heart. And because he's not taken it to heart, he will die. He will not be redeemed. The last we hear of Nebuchadnezzar the Great is his testimony. The last we hear of Belshazzar is his arrogance has condemned him. And that is the message of Daniel 5. That's what's happening here. Now, the lesson asks certain questions. We'll take a look at that. And we think we've answered most of these questions by our examination of the well, let's see what we can do here. What is Belshazzar doing that is so bad? This reveals his true character because he is arrogant. The uninvited guest, we talked about this. This is amazing. Yes, the queen reminds him, we've covered all of this. This is all over. The fall of Babylon. Cyrus, as we find in Isaiah, was designated as the Messiah. He would deliver. And that is the other part. The king, the God who delivers. He is delivering Israel in the person of Daniel. And as we shall see in Daniel 6, he serves the Medes and the Persians as well as he served Babylon. So the empire, the rulers of the empires change, but God's rulership and his representation through Daniel remains the same. The people at the top, they're different. But the people who run things, it's very much like the bureaucracy. That's what's happening here. Daniel is going to continue to be a most influential person. Well, that's pretty much it. It's a little bit shorter tonight, but that's not always a bad thing. Daniel 5, again, the three great themes. The God who rules, we got that again. This is brought home repeatedly to Belshazzar. It's God who rules, not you. Your father Nebuchadnezzar understood that and was humbled, and that's how he survived. The God who gives wisdom. Belshazzar's testimony is that I've heard that God gives wisdom to you. And wisdom can only be received by those who are not arrogant. I've often said that arrogance is the ultimate learning disability. We think we know, we don't learn. And the God who delivers. And Babylon falls. The man he is talking to, Belshazzar, is slain. Probably a very great many men drinking from those vessels. Maybe some of the women too, I have no idea. But many of the people in that room who were profaning the vessels of the temple of the Most High were slain that night. But Daniel lives on and remains a power, a man of influence, even in the next administration, the next empire. It's important. God is delivering his people. The conquerors appear to be in charge. God is in charge. The conquerors appear to be enslaving the children of Israel, but God is punishing them. He's reminding them. He's getting their attention. This is what he did with Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. He got the man's attention. You can't do this and continue to be ruler. And he's getting Israel's attention again. You can't do this if you want to remain independent. If you want to remain your own kingdom, you must do certain things in certain ways. And he's getting they wouldn't listen when they were in Jerusalem. So now they have to learn it the hard way. We all do that, don't we? We learn things the hard way. It seems like far too much of the time. And God is delivered. God who delivers. He delivers his people. He delivers us from our arrogance. He delivered Nebuchadnezzar from his arrogance. Belshazzar didn't want to be delivered from his arrogance. He didn't understand. He wanted to be what he was. And that's just not enough. Well, I hope this has been useful. I know it's been short, but the chiastic structure really, as you can see when we go through the lesson, cuts to the heart of understanding the book. The literary structure tells us so much about this. And next week we're going to get to Daniel 6, and I should be, Lord willing, live. And Daniel 6 I find fascinating. I've said that it's a parallel to Daniel 3, and next week, the next lesson, we shall examine just how true that is, how much in detail we find this to be accurate, that Daniel 6 and Daniel 2 are so alike. They're telling us a similar message and focusing our attention on the God who delivers. Well, may your week be a good one. May you continue to enjoy the treasures of the Word. And Lord willing, may we get together a week from tonight. Until then.